So I just want to say welcome and good morning to everyone who's here with us. This is the VMCC online webinar for green shipping corridors, decarbonizing the world's ocean transportation highways. It's quite a mouthful there for me this morning, but I think I managed my way through it. If you don't know me, my name is Elizabeth Charmley. I'm the Executive Director of the Vancouver Maritime Centre for Climate, or VMCC as we're called for short. We are a maritime decarbonization hub located here on the Pacific Northwest, and we are dedicated to helping the regional maritime and shipping transport sector reach zero emissions. So green shipping corridors is a very important part of that work that we are doing, and we greatly appreciate all our members' discussion and comments around this, and this morning's webinar is part of that series. But before I get started, I want to take a moment that I'm joining you today from Canada, specifically from Vancouver, British Columbia. And this is from the unceded and traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people. If you have not heard of a land acknowledgement before, the act of acknowledging the land is an act of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's an expression of respect and gratitude for the land. This action is to remind us that our places of work, where we live and where we gather, are on the traditional lands of First Nations, specifically the Inuit and Métis people who historically resided here, and they still presently do. It is also an act of reconciliation and an acknowledgement that all of us are accountable to these relationships on a daily basis. I'd encourage you to take a moment and consider your connection to the land for which you are joining our event today. And if you like, you're welcome to share your thoughts and comments in the chat pane. So with that said, we're going to kick things off here with our first speakers. We have two speakers joining us from across the pond, the European time zone from the Boston Consulting Group. It's an absolute pleasure to have them here with us this morning to help us bring a bit of outside of North America perspective to green shipping corridors and the work that we are doing. And we have as our first speaker, Peter Jameson from BCG. And Peter is a partner in the Copenhagen office of the Boston Consulting Group. He will give a little more information about himself, and then following him is his colleague, Søren. And Søren is a member of BCG's global leadership for shipping decarbonization and a core member of sustainability and climate in BCG. Welcome, Peter and Søren.
Thank you. Do you want to go to the second slide for us? We bring that straight up. So good morning and good evening, depending where you are in the world. I'm Peter Jameson. As mentioned, I'm based here in Copenhagen. As you can probably tell from the accent, I'm an Englishman. I have salt water running through my veins. I spent some time in nuclear submarines in the British Royal Navy. But since then, I've been focusing on climate and sustainability topics. And now working with BCG, where we have over 22,000 employees globally. We're not just a management consulting company working with organizations, we're also at the moment playing a big role in helping those organizations around the globe, whether they're the COP26 organization, the World Economic Forum, or some of the shipping centers that have been set up recently around the world, really to start shaping the topic of a transition to a zero carbon future. And really in the work that we're doing at the moment, three key things to highlight. And this is particularly coming out of the back of both COP26 last year and also the events that we saw in Davos in the last couple of weeks. Firstly, what we're continuing to see is courageous leadership, both from world leaders, but also from CEOs alike. Yet the challenge is that there are still too many people and too many companies sitting on the fence and ready to let others take risks. The second thing I wanted to call out is really that there is more clarity coming with regards to emerging technologies. And we see that particularly in the maritime industry, where there is a belief that either ammonia or methanol will be the future destination fuels, with biofuel potentially being that interim fuel. So we're starting to see this technology become real. Yet the challenge is there is still a huge gap of bringing those new technologies actually to large scale and to wide-ranging use. The third key thing that I want to call out is that whilst these transition roadmaps are starting to take place, both in companies but also in countries and organizations, we are not yet seeing the opportunity to reset some of the inequalities that we see in the world at the moment. And this is where this just transition that is starting to be talked about is becoming ever more important. And I think we believe that after this technology question and regulation question has been answered in the maritime industry, we will start to see a move towards solving this just transition, making sure that it is an equitable transition for all. Before we jump and dive deep into green corridors, I just wanted to reflect a little bit more broadly around what we're seeing in the maritime ecosystem. And in the last 24 months, if we can jump to the next slide, please. Next one. Fantastic. In the last 24 months, we've seen an explosion of initiatives in the maritime space. From the commitments and investments that we saw at COP26, I just want to call out a couple of these that really show how bringing the industry together can make a lot of things happen. And what's important to bear in mind here is that not only are there no silver bullets from a technology perspective, there are also no silver bullets to solve the other challenges that are faced in this transition, be that policy, commitments, or financing. So before we dive deep into green corridors, three I want to call out here is one around the First Movers Coalition. And this was an initiative really to try and tackle this chicken or the egg challenge. So really with energy consumers now sending a really strong message, an unequivocal message to energy producers that the future is actually green. This will start to help the required capital movement to take place. And alone in shipping, it's estimated that over $2.4 trillion is actually required to reach a carbon neutral fleet by 2050. Then we had this COSEV announcement, and this was another example of setting intentions. And this is where the cargo owners came together really to send a clear signal to ship owners and operators that decarbonisation will become a must-have. And then the last one I want to call out is this idea of public-private organizations coming together, which is also particularly important for the green corridors. But this State of Green was a super example of where we have public-private entities coming together, creating political momentum around a transition. And who knows, with some of these political movements, perhaps we'll start to see the IMO becoming more aggressive than they are at the moment. So let's dig a little bit deeper, and the question then becomes, how do you actually get going on this transition? It's all good talking about plans, talking about future technologies, but how do you get moving? And that is the overall idea of green corridors. We jump to the next slide, please. Very good. So when at BCG we're trying to solve problems, we really want to first understand what problem are we trying to solve. And with the maritime industry transition, it's a super complex set of challenges, be it technology, regulation, finance, fuel availability, and so the list goes on. And therefore the question becomes is, how do you break those challenges down? And put simply, a green corridor is the idea of how to break it down and how to really get started without stagnation in trying to get both political, technological, and finance agreements going. So the concept in essence is quite simple. You get two agreeable and collaborative destinations to agree to test and trial the introduction of a zero carbon future. And that's not just zero carbon fuels, it's also the way that you're going to bunker those fuels, how you're going to provide them. And it's a matter of bringing together authorities, ports, shipping companies, financiers, ship owners, with really an aligned focus to create these highways of the sea. And to put this quite simply in theory, the devil is really in the detail. And that's now why we're starting to see these initiatives that were aligned with the Clydebank Declaration and Green Corridors. We're now seeing the noises and the announcements coming out of what are the fuels that these growing corridors are going to use. What technologies are they going to use from land to sea? And it's that level of detail which will then mean now in the coming months that we'll see an actual acceleration and application of those chosen technologies. Now, before I hand over to Søren, I just want to just bring up an interesting picture here. If we jump to the next slide, please. So whilst this graph looks quite complicated, I just want to break it down for you. So what you see here is with lines and arrows, you see the idea of those green corridors, whether those are the corridors that connect the west coast of Australia with Japan from an iron ore perspective, or whether you take a container or ro-ro perspective from Asia across to Western Europe. But what's interesting is when you start to overlay onto there where future fuel availability and future fuel projects are starting to fall. And not surprisingly, we're finding that actually where the conditions are perfect for hydrogen-based fuel development, that's not necessarily where fuel is needed from a maritime perspective. So what we are likely to see, and the shipping industry has long overcome this challenge of fuel availability versus where it's needed, we're going to see the bunkering of methanol and ammonia around the world to those locations away from where they're being produced to the actual destinations themselves. So we see a continued dynamic here between identifying green corridors, getting those moving, and that interaction also with hydrogen fuel production. Søren, do you want to take the baton from me and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. So yeah, I'm Søren Møller. I'm an associate director with Boston Consulting Group based in Copenhagen. My entire career I've worked with energy, offshore and maritime, across the value chain, from production, transport and utilization. And then in the second half of my career, if you like, I've worked with the maritime decarbonization, being part of the executive leadership team at the Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping, until joining Boston Consulting Group, where I now work together with Peter on really helping all of our clients globally on decarbonization of shipping. So what I want to do is to maybe go to the next slide in our deck and take a few examples. It's 3 slides, so I hope you'll bear with us. Being consultants, we do bring slides. So this one is talking to the importance of the ports in this transition and of the green corridors. So we do realize that we have the players across the value chain, and everybody are important to get this going, from energy production, transport, conversion, logistics and ports, the ship technology and solutions on board the vessels, super important, regulatory and finance. But really we see that the ports taking a leading role in creating the momentum and doing pilots, as we're showing in this slide, where we see different players coming together, focused on the port and showing that using methanol and ammonia as bunkering fuel can be done. I think we all know that methanol and ammonia, I mean, they are chemicals being traded globally, but using them as bunker fuel and doing it in a port simultaneously with unloading, offloading containers, for instance, is a different thing. And you have to prove this. And we see this going on. And we see quite a lot of initiatives globally happening, driven by ports in many instances, and also connected to the green corridors that Peter had talked to. That was the main point here. It's a busy slide. You can see there are a lot of examples. I think one of the interesting perspectives is also that the timeline it's within a few years, 1-2 years, we believe to have this demonstrated. This coincides with the first vessels being ready, sailing on ammonia and methanol, and also with the scaling of and availability of these fuels becoming available. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about who should really finance this. How do we get going? And we believe strongly in the power of regulatory regimes being incentivizing the players across the globe. So as a green corridors, we're luckily seeing the regulators playing a large role in that and setting it up. And the role of regulators can be twofold here. It's both to incentivize the pioneers who want to go first, making sure there is a level playing ground where they know what the investments, what the framework is, what the risk and opportunities are in this, but also making sure that the players that want to stay compliant, that they are also moved ahead. So both incentivizing the first movers, but also making sure that everybody is moving. So So we see it as a key importance that all regions develop and implement these ambitious and binding targets, and this will help leveling the playing field in the transnational business that shipping is. So another point here is also that it's important that the regulators do not just go ahead by themselves, but consult the industry when doing this. So we see a connection between where the industry needs the incentives and what is then actually happening. Another element of finance can be the customer's willingness to pay, and that's the next slide, Sophie, please. Sophie, if we go to the next slide. Here we did a survey. Just waiting for the slide to move. But I can warm it up and saying that yeah, here it is. Just showing some of the results of the survey we did, interviewing 125 shipping decision makers across industries and geographies to map shipping customers' demand for and drivers of and willingness to pay for carbon neutral shipping. And interestingly enough, carbon neutral shipping is demanded. That's the good news. 71% of all customers willing to pay a premium for it, and 63% expected to increase in the near term, while 67% expect to be more loyal to a zero carbon carrier. 58% find legislation as being the strongest driver for this. But those with the highest willingness to pay are more motivated by competitive advantage. So it's about the front runners, and they see a business advantage here, but also that we need the regulation to get going, really. So the average overall willingness to pay is around a 2% markup. And to fund the decarbonization requires a 10 to 15% premium. So the customers are not going to pay all of it. They'll be part of it, but more is needed. So our advice to shipping companies here is to clearly communicate the ambitions, differentiate the offering between the climate pioneers and compliance seekers. So where do we want to play? Do we want to be a pioneer, or do we just want to stay compliant? And then focus on the partnerships. So for instance, the green corridors, and being part of that, and then team up with where there are customers that are willing to pay, basically. So main points being that ports playing a pivotal role. I'm sure Alex will talk to that as well as the next presenter. Regulators playing a crucial role in getting this going, but also making sure there's a level playing field across. And customers, they have willingness to pay, but they're not going to finance all of it. So we cannot rely on customers only. So thank you for listening, and I think we're ready to go to Alex on his view on the green corridor.
Thank you so much, Peter and Søren. That was absolutely wonderful. And I kind of appreciate the context that you guys drove into there, like a bit of talking about the consortiums, and then like what it takes, how to finance, a little bit of the details, because I would suspect some people are joining us this morning looking to think like, how do I actually get started on this, right? So having that background is really good. And I have a couple of questions noted for you, but I will hold them until after Alex has spoken. And I encourage anyone who has questions, please type them in the chat pane. I'll keep an eye on them. And then once Alex is done speaking, we'll have an open discussion where everyone can take part. So now I would like to welcome Alex Adams. He is the Senior Environmental Program Manager at the Port of Seattle. Alex is also a licensed captain, I noticed in his bio, but more importantly, he is committed to experimental education and addressing the complex issue of climate change and creating opportunities that inspire others to learn about science, the natural world, and themselves. And I have to say that's a very inspiring part of his bio that I chose to share with you, because of course, when we have a passion for climate change, which I think a lot of us do, that's when really we can work together and make the most difference. So it's a real pleasure to have you here with us this morning, Alex. And with that, I will hand the floor over to you.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to VMCC for having me here today. This is a really great opportunity to talk about something that I am very personally excited about, but also I think Port of Seattle and many of our partners are also excited about. Yeah, as Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Alex Adams. I manage Port of Seattle's Maritime Sustainability Program, which includes all of our climate change, air quality, and energy work. And what I hope to talk about today is not only our big announcement and efforts moving forward around a green corridor, but also some of the building blocks and how we think about green corridors at Port of Seattle and why we think this is a good idea and we're well positioned to take a leadership role in this with some of our first mover partners. So before I talk about that, I want to just, for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with Port of Seattle, I want to just give a little bit of an overview about what our port does. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So we are, Port of Seattle is the largest cruise port on the US West Coast. We have, at this point, 3 cruise terminals. As you can see them here, Smith Cove has 2 berths, and the Bell Street Cruise Terminal has 1 berth. The 2 berths at Terminal 91 are equipped with shore power, and we were the first port globally to have 2 shore power connections for cruise ships. And we found that those connections are widely used. This last season, I believe over 97% of those ships that had a shore power connection connected. And we see it as one of our greatest climate strategies. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but also air emissions from ships at berth. And as you can see, ships are moored in very close proximity to the downtown area. So those air quality benefits are significant. In addition to being a cruise port, you may be familiar with SeaTac International Airport. That's also part of Port of Seattle. We are also one half of what's called the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which is a cargo partnership that formed between Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma in 2015. And now the Northwest Seaport Alliance manages all of the cargo operations in Seattle. In addition, we also are home to the U.S. North Pacific fishing fleet that provides a significant amount of commercial fish products to the U.S. And other regions. Next slide, please. So cruise operations in Seattle has about a 20-year history, and it has grown significantly. So you can see back in 1999, we had 6 cruise ships. And as of this season, we're expecting 296 cruise calls and 1.3 million passengers. On an annual basis, the cruise industry provides about $900 million in revenue to the region. Sorry, I'm getting a notice that my CPU usage is high. Let me know if for whatever reason I cut out and you can't hear me. So as you can see, the cruise industry has really grown in its significance. In addition to growing the number of calls and the number of passengers, the focus on environmental sustainability has also significantly increased. And today it is, I would say, one of the top the top issues that are essential for us to focus on if we are to be successful into the future running a cruise industry. And so this sort of frames up one of the reasons why we feel a green corridor is really the logical but also essential next step in our cruise industry in Seattle and hopefully in our region. Next slide, please. So a little bit more context. So these 2 pie graphs show the total maritime emissions in Seattle. And as I mentioned, the Northwest Seaport Alliance represents a significant portion of that. They're the fourth largest cargo gateway in the U.S. And associated with that is obviously a lot of greenhouse gas emissions too. So you can see on the left-hand side, this sort of blue wedge, that's Port of Seattle in its entirety. So that represents all of Port of Seattle's lines of business in comparison to the things like drayage trucks and cargo ships. And if you look on the right-hand side, this smaller circle pie graph shows that cruise ships represent a significant portion, 68% of the Port of Seattle's emissions. Much smaller are recreational vessels, our port administration, the buildings we own and operate, the rail serving our grain terminal, commercial fishing, and grain ships. So cruise ships, if we are to address our ambitious climate goals, which are to be a zero-emission seaport by 2050, we have to address these really hard-to-abate sectors, specifically ocean-going vessels like cruise ships underway. We have made significant progress in reducing emissions since we started measuring back in 2005, and in large part due to the partnership we have with Port of Vancouver and Port of Tacoma and the Northwest Ports Clean Air Strategy, which is a voluntary and collaborative air and climate strategy that we all work on together. Despite the fact that we're fierce competitors, the strategy's intention is to set environmental action above competitive interests. And since we started measuring, we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 17% and diesel particulate matter by 84%. Obviously, that's great, but we have a lot of work to do to achieve our zero emission ambitions in the future. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is the big announcement that we made at the International Association of Ports and Harbors conference in last month, mid-May. We've announced that this group of partners, mainly the ends of a corridor between Port of Seattle and Port of Vancouver and Juneau in Alaska, alongside some of the largest cruise lines in the world. And for Port of Seattle, these are our three largest cruise tenants and customers. So Carnival Corporation, Royal Caribbean Group, and Norwegian Cruise Lines and their subsidiaries. In addition to the ends of the green corridor, so to speak, and the middle, the cruise line industries, we have a number of supporting decarbonization partners, one of whom is the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition. The other is a Global Maritime Forum, and then Maritime Blue, as well as the Cruise Line Industry Association, CLIA. So this is something that we are extremely excited about. It's a very new thing, and it's as you heard in the previous presenters, there are significant challenges with this, and I'll be very forthright in saying we don't have the answers yet. And the effort that we are committing to is exploring the feasibility of a green corridor and really spending time together understanding what the dimensions of that corridor are and what we need to address in order to be successful. Obviously, fuels are a big issue, policy, technologies, many of the things you heard previously. So next slide, please. So as I think I mentioned earlier, the green corridor really stitches together many of our environmental ambitions. And when we heard about the Clydebank Declaration at COP26, a light bulb went off in our heads, and I think it went off in other heads as well. And we realized, that the Pacific Northwest is a unique place, and the cruise industry is a unique industry in this region. We feel that we have a strategic advantage. The cruise industry, Port of Seattle, just like Port of Vancouver, is a gateway to the Alaska cruise market. Cruise ships operate in sort of a closed circuit. And by bringing in the Alaska ports, we close that circuit. We are aligning our ambitions around zero emissions and bringing the cruise lines along with us. They also have very clear stated goals to address climate change. Many of those lines have zero emission ambitions that align perfectly with ours. We also know that climate urgency is paramount. It's a growing political expectation as well as a community expectation. And as I mentioned, it's unlikely that we will be successful as a port if we don't take ambitious action. And Port of Seattle has a long history of being a leader in this area, and this is the perfect opportunity for us to continue that legacy and push for industry to move as quickly as possible along with us. Environmental justice. We heard about the just transition. This is also paramount, and we share many of the same issues with ports in Alaska as well as Vancouver. And that just transition is really going to be truly essential to the success of this because there are benefits associated with decarbonization beyond just addressing climate change. And we want to be sure those are shared by all. And then finally, economic opportunity. Our working hypothesis is that by taking early and ambitious action to confront climate change will provide us with a competitive advantage in the future. And so far that's proven true. And we saw in the previous presentation that people are willing to pay more, and we continue that we expect that to be true in the future. We also recognize there's a significant job creation opportunity, and it's an exciting proposition to bring those economic benefits and a larger coalition to Alaska, where some of the smaller ports may not have the staffing resources and capabilities to apply for big grants and take the effort that is needed to be successful here. Next slide, please. So we're thinking about 4 building blocks, and this is shamelessly stolen from the Getting to Zero Coalition's report, The Next Wave on Green Corridors. And we really see, the ticket to our success and the areas that we'll be exploring feasibility or cross-value chain collaboration. We need stakeholders who are committed to decarbonization. We need alignment and commitment around those zero emission goals. And then, of course, the focused resources to make that possible. And one of our hopes is that by taking early action with the cruise industry in the Pacific Northwest, we can focus those global resources in our area and work to decarbonize the cruise industry in the Pacific Northwest first. Of course, another major issue is that viable zero emission fuel pathway. And we are, so far, have been fuel agnostic. However, we also have been working very hard to develop the partnerships and the research capabilities to explore the fuels coming down the line. Many of those you probably are aware of. Of course, policy and regulation is also another key element here. And in Washington State, we have just passed a low carbon fuel standard, which puts us onto a level playing field with British Columbia, California, and Oregon. And we see that as, the first step in the necessary policy that we believe will continue to be essential for us achieving these goals. And finally, stakeholder and customer demand. We've certainly heard the stakeholder interest in achieving zero emissions immediately, as fast as possible. We also know that's not possible to do immediately. And so we have to work to figure out how we can cultivate, the partnerships, the willingness to pay, the key stakeholders and their priorities around making this effort successful. So the next slide, and I believe that's my last slide, is just going to outline the next steps. So when we announced this last month, we committed to having our first meeting in the next 30 days, and that meeting is on Monday. So we are intending to move quickly. It's the first of many meetings and discussions about what a partnership looks like. Those first key things we need to establish is the governance structure, the frameworks, how we work together, because we've already heard significant interest from other partners, ranging from the cargo industry to the fishing industry and others. And we need to make sure that we are collaborative and keep an open door, but also have a governance structure that ensures that this grand idea doesn't collapse under its own weight. So we need to maintain a sort of a nimble framework if possible. And as I just mentioned, we'll continue to invite new partners once we sort of have this initial approach established with those who have signed on at the beginning. We intend to create a charter and then establish a feasibility study to explore what exactly a green corridor means and what is needed here in the Pacific Northwest to be successful. And it will likely identify the challenges and pathways we need to move forward. And so with that, I'll stop and happy to address any questions. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk more about this in detail.
No, that was absolutely wonderful, Alex. I really appreciate it. I think that was really complimentary group of speakers that we had with us this morning, kind of coming from the broader sense down to the focused what is happening right here in our region. For me, I feel like I learned a lot, and that was very interesting. Thank you. So we have a few questions that have been submitted into the chat pane. I'm going to start with the earliest one from Sheldon. I don't know, Sheldon, if you want me to read your question out loud or you wanted to I think Sophie can unmute you and you're welcome to address it directly to the speakers. Okay, so I will read the question here. So Sheldon Fernandez from Bright Spot Climate has asked, and this was just after Søren and Peter had spoke. He said, maybe getting ahead of the later content here, but it seems like there's a wide range of stakeholders seeking to create green shipping corridors. Who do you think is the best place to create a consolidated definition? IMO or a consensus-based organization like the International Standards Organization? Part of what would be at play here, presumably, is what fuels are used by vessels within a corridor. Is it within consideration that what is being shipped, for example, thermal coal, may be precluded from this definition? So I think two parts to the question. I'll go back to the first one there. So who do you think is best placed to create a consolidated definition?
Great question, and let me take a stab at that, and please, Alex, Søren, jump in here. And look, I'm a pragmatist, and I truly believe that we shouldn't be waiting for rules and regulations, consensus around the globe around what is, what isn't, what should be, what can't be a green corridor. I think we just need to get going. And I think the movement that Alex, and his organization has taken, what we've seen happening on the west coast of Australia and Japanese route, they're just getting going. Have they got the perfect answer? Have they got, consensus around whether this carrying, a heavy emitting product is in or out of a green corridor? I'm not sure that's as important as actually organizations and collaborative ports and stakeholders just getting moving on this topic. At least that's my personal view, at least.
I can add to it, and I'm doubtful we will ever get to a consolidated definition of green corridors, what it is, because it'll have many different shapes and forms. As you're also saying, Peter, it's about getting going. So making sure that when there is a path, and if the business or the firms see an opportunity and a case, that they play together with the regulators to establish green corridors and networks, or maybe just for a port to make sure that there is green fuel available. It can have many different shapes and sizes, and I think, as you're saying, Peter, it's about getting going and not so much to agree on a common definition, because this is about creating an acceleration, really.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer about who is the best to sort of convene and define, but what I think is important is that those who are embarking on a green corridor work together to ensure that the corridors aren't all different from each other. The worst case scenario is you have, many green corridors around the world that all have different rules, and you don't know if what's green on one corridor is green on another. And so, the way that we're thinking about it, and we've been working very closely with the Port of Los Angeles in understanding how they're defining a green corridor, and certainly the U.S. State Department has perspectives in the Getting to Zero Coalition, et cetera. But the way we're thinking about it is, if we can agree that a green corridor is focused on zero greenhouse gas emissions, or it could even be broader than that, but we're talking about zero greenhouse gas emissions, then we can all identify what makes our respective green corridors unique, and potentially consider other things that are different than that. Everyone has, regions have their own unique environmental issues, and whether or not those are included in a green corridor, so to speak, is, I think, to be determined. But the initial intention in our mind is to eliminate climate emissions.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, and we often get questions about that. As you know, VMCC has our green shipping strategy, which sources solutions for 5 implementation pathways. And recently someone came to me and said, oh, is this a solution for green shipping corridors? And I took a double take at it. I said, actually, yeah, I think it kind of is. I didn't realize. So I think, we can expand right from alternative fuels all the way up to what's actually being shipped on the route. But I think Alex's point is key, is that really, if we're all just trying to get to zero, that's the most important foundation that we have as part of this work.
There's a super important discussion. Sorry to interrupt, I didn't mean to, but there's a super important discussion, which is perhaps not so much the green corridor, but the definition of what is a green fuel, right? I think that's also what you're talking to, Alex. So when is it actually zero emissions, right? Because there'll always be some emissions at least until we get to a better solutions. So really about defining green or zero, what does it mean? And so the life cycle analysis, that is going to be super important to agree on. And I think we're seeing IMO taking steps. Other parties are taking steps as well. So I think that's where we really need a good definition that can go across. In my opinion, green corridors can be something different, and it's not super important that they are perfectly aligned, but the life cycle analysis and the carbon footprint of fuels, that's a place where we need to agree.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, because we see with some alternative fuels, large modification to land, or I think it was the BCG group who mentioned that in places where there is strong hydrogen supply, there's not a maritime demand. So that could be an issue too, because we have a lot of talk about hydrogen use on maritime assets, and yet, that's still a question mark in my mind, yet to be answered. So I see a lot of questions, which is absolutely great. The next one is from Kim Dunn at WWF, and she has mentioned a question for Alex. Are you able to share more detail about the feasibility study? For example, the process, timeline, transparency, opportunity for engagement with the community, scientists, indigenous governments, and civil society?
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like I'm dodging the question, but I'm not. We have yet to determine what is exactly included in the feasibility study, and we are being deliberate about that. One of the key approaches we're taking in this effort is sort of consensus-based and collaborative approach, and we thought it would not be the right approach to come to our partners with a predetermined set of analyses that we want them to conduct. I think each one of our partners, the cruise lines and the ports, are all very savvy about the pathways to zero emissions and what their respective issues and challenges are. And so we wanted to, before we define what a feasibility study is, we wanted to have that conversation and understand how we can shape that in a way that meets the needs of all parties and also gets us to the goal. I will also say to the question about engagement and collaboration, we have a long history of working across sectors and with partners, and it's our absolute intention to keep an open door and to bring as many partners into this as appropriate. And that also includes, as you mentioned, tribal governments, communities, the stakeholders who either care the most or seek to benefit the most. Definitely do, though, want to be cognizant about who is a participant in this and ensure that they are both adding value and getting value from this.
Yeah, those are very good points. Okay, the next question is from Frank, and he has asked for Peter and Søren. He said it was very interesting to hear about the focus on ammonia and methanol bunkering initiatives. He has two questions. Can you speak to any such initiatives in the works in the Pacific Northwest? And he would also love to hear about your viewpoint on the use of renewable fuels, such as renewable diesel, HDRD, and renewable natural gas for the near term and going forward.
Questions.
You want me to loop back to that and repeat anything again? Let me know.
I think I can read it as well. But maybe actually Alex or yourself, Elizabeth, are better positioned to talk about bunkering pilots in the Pacific Northwest than we are, I would think. So I'm not sure if there are any reflections, Alex, from your side or Elizabeth, on that. You'll be closer to the action than we are, at least.
Yeah, exactly. I'll let Alex maybe field that for his region, but here in British Columbia, there's definitely a push to start with more alternative fuels. We have established a hydrogen hub in our region, and so VMCC is in close contact with them to figure out market demand for that. We do have LNG supply as well, which I know is not such a popular fuel moving forward, but we do have ship owners in our region bunkering for that. And then the other fuels like hydrogen, right now we get a lot of requests even from our members asking you know, where can I get hydrogen? Mainly for port operations, actually, less so much for ships themselves. And we don't really have a strong supply of that right now. It's kind of the green hydrogen, because they only want green hydrogen, going back to that point of where the alternative fuel is coming from and how it's refined. That is sort of 100% accounted for in current operations. And I'm just speaking to the best of my knowledge. If we have other members who can add, I'm happy to read your comments if you enter them in the chat pane. But I don't believe we have any. We have discussions for things like methanol and ammonia, kind of what would be demand for that. Nothing quite for that yet. And for biofuels, we do have ship owners who are continuing to use that. And I believe in BC, we even at the pump for your car have some legislation where there's a bit of blending happening for that. And Alex, I will hand things over to you with that.
Yeah, sure. So Port of Seattle is not in the business of providing fuel. We have some of our property is leased. I believe this is true, leased to fuel providers, but that relationship is between the fuel companies and the ships. So we don't have, you know, direct control over the types of fuels that are being used. That said, we recognize that the ports play an important role in this conversation, and we are in the process of completing what we call the Seattle Waterfront Clean Energy Strategy, which is a partnership between Port of Seattle, the Northwest Seaport Alliance, and our local utility, Seattle City Light. And it's exploring the grid modernization and alternative fuels needed and infrastructure needed to enable that industry transition. So our objective is to do that work ahead of time right now, so that the infrastructure can be in place when industry makes a decision about the fuels and the connections and all the, you know, the technical choices that they want in the future. We're also, like Vancouver, pretty closely involved in exploration of hydrogen. We have a number of partnerships underway with the local utility, as well as some of the U.S. national laboratories, to explore the risks, the feasibility, et cetera, associated with hydrogen hubs for, you know, smaller, you know, like a truck fueling station, but also larger storage and use for things like ships. That's happening in addition to some other work around connected microgrids and, you know, what are the grid modernization things that need to happen to both provide the clean fuels, but also build resilience in our grid and our community.
Yeah. Any other comments, Peter? I thought I heard you about to jump in there.
Yeah, exactly. So just from a fuels perspective, I think really good question with regards to HDRD and renewable natural gas. Now, you know, obviously they're showing progress at the moment as far as being able to use these, and I think they could play a role as in the transition. Why? Because of course it will allow, you know, with current assets, people not to have stranded assets and use them during that period. I think the challenge, some of the biggest challenges we see here is around the potential cost of that of those fuels and the ability to deliver that at a value that the industry is able to pay, particularly during this transition where we don't see that willingness to pay. We don't see the regulation as strong as it could be. And my only concern about going down one of my concerns around going down the renewable natural gas and HDRD route is that we are potentially, as a result of that, sidestepping and not necessarily diverting enough attention and therefore money towards what is potentially the destination fuels. Yeah. But I'm very aware that, you know, there is not going to be one fuel at the end of this. There is going to be a plethora of fuels that we use during the transition and also in the final state.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And we often talk about that you know, there be some band-aids, so to speak, along the way, but at the end we want to reach the final destination, right? Like that's the goal. We want to get to zero. So just noticing that we have 9 minutes left, I will continue to engage our panelists with the questions. There's quite a few of them, but if anybody needs to depart, we'll just say thank you now and please go ahead. I don't know if our panelists need to depart exactly at the hour. That's more than fine, but I will just continue with the questions and discussion here. So the next question is from Eric Huberdeau. And he has asked, what are your thoughts on the need to align policies or regulations across jurisdictions within a green corridor and across different corridors? And I know we've touched on this a little bit briefly, but just to sort of circle back to that, I think it's important, even from a Canadian perspective, where we're kind of saddled with our neighbors to the United States, just to, revisit that again. Any additional comments that our panelists wanted to add to that?
I think, some of the regulations that need to exist, we're still learning about. I think the climate policies and policies that incentivize, the currently more expensive, cleaner or zero emission fuels are going to be essential. No one said being a first mover was cheap, and it comes with risk, and it comes with, the bearer of the initial first costs to show the way forward. And so I think part of the work that will come from the feasibility study we've been discussing, and certainly from other corridors, is a better understanding of the role for governments and regulators to play in this conversation. I also think one of the issues that is not often discussed is the technological and sort of class society role in enabling new technologies to be used aboard ships. Obviously, the maritime industry is highly regulated, and it's no small feat to put giant batteries or some sort of hydrogen or a derivative on board ships, and it needs to be done safely and in a coordinated manner. And so the role for those classifying agencies and in the U.S. Coast Guard and American Bureau of Shipping is going to be really huge, and it could, if not addressed sort of early on, and if they're not at the table in some of these early conversations, it could really delay progress, because it takes a lot of work to come up with those regulations in a way that applies to all the vessel types.
That's true. Yeah, which kind of reminds me of even the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 compliance. Is it possible? I would just throw that out there, that we might see something like that for green shipping corridors, that we see, as ports and regions are trying to achieve, that we see it sort of broken down into phases or tiers in a similar fashion. I don't know if Søren or Peter want to dive in. Have you heard anything to that regard in your consulting? Yeah.
No, I'm just also reflecting on some of the questions here, going back to alignment. Whilst it is important to be pragmatic to get things going, I do appreciate, the need also to make sure that this alignment between what is, for example, what is an okay way, and what are the rules and regulations around handling a future ammonia as a bunker fuel, right? I think, going back to one of my original points, the devil is in the detail. And I think, Alex, as you're kind of alluding to now, you're only now starting to open up Pandora's box, and what became, what was a great ambition, now the rubber hits the road. And of course, and I have one question for Alex, actually, if you're okay with that, Elizabeth. I'm just really curious, Alex. You've been running at this for some months now. Great hype around it. When you're standing there, what do you think is going to be one of your biggest challenges to actually get this off the ground? What is that one thing you're gonna run into?
Yeah, it's going to relate to fuels. We have this, Seattle and Vancouver are uniquely positioned favorably to, afford and accommodate different fuel types. But, our partner ports in Alaska, Juneau and Sitka and Skagway are very small communities. And, we're going to need to figure out, the fuel types that align between, our big ports, a cruise ship, which is no small energy consumer, and those rural ports, and figuring out what that fuel type is, and then figuring out how, when, and where ships bunker, I think, is going to be a major issue. And then the costs and affording that, I think, are going to be the biggest challenges.
Absolutely. Sorry, Elizabeth, I messed up the flow there with asking the question.
No, I think that's great. Exactly. We want to facilitate and encourage this type of discussion, right? Because it's very important, the knowledge sharing component and part of this that we're in right now. Yeah, because I do see, Peter, even a lot of questions here. Another one from Eric mentioning the definitions, a framework similar to what the US State Department has published. Would this be helpful? And then another one from Jeff Pelton mentioning curious to understand how these corridors are work on geography where there is only one corridor for all vessels. So I think we sort of covered off these questions here. And he mentions a commitment from one vessel type cruise, which is a good example to innovate along that route. We have a bit of a different question from Brian Buggy. It's from or for the Port of Seattle, for Alex, for yourself, asking how are you connecting with Seattle's innovator community through trials, pilots, or other programs?
Yeah, we're really closely connected. In fact, our Washington Maritime Blue, which is the VMCC equivalent of Washington, has been a really close partner on a lot of this work. They're, one of our first movers, and they are sort of leading and convening the many conversations around the technology and fuels issues, and have been doing that before this announcement. So, which is what made them a great partner. And VMCC, I assume, does the same in Canada and Vancouver and BC. We're also, as I mentioned, partnering with our national laboratories. The private sector, we have a lot of private industries that are exploring things like, hydrogen trucks and battery electric trucks, hydrogen fuel cells. We have a hydrogen fuel cell manufacturing company actually located in Seattle. So we're very closely connected with those innovators. If you know of others who you think we should be in contact with, please let us know. We're always learning and always shocked to hear what people are working on. And, our hope is to sort of, at the end of the day, serve as conveners in this conversation and pull together the resources and people and thought leaders in order to help us be successful. Because, like, if I've told you anything today, it's we don't have the answers. So we need help from people like you and many others.
That's wonderful. So I see we have 1 minute left, and as many of the questions were on the same theme, I think we had a lot of discussion around them. The last question was to BCG about how to access your studies, and I see that Alex, let me just scroll up here. You have posted a link, Peter, to their studies where you can find it online if any of our guests are interested in accessing that. Boston Consulting Group has a lot of interesting information that is just publicly available, as well as on their website for payer purchase or access to those. So with that, I think that wraps up all our questions, because a lot of them were sort of on that same theme of definitions and how to work across geographical boundaries. So it was sort of interesting to hear the feedback that seems to be a major concern on people's minds as we move forward. But I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers. It was absolutely wonderful to have you here with us this morning. I appreciate you joining us and sharing your thoughts and opinions and work in progress to date. I think this has been absolutely wonderful discussion, and also many thanks to our guests who have joined us. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and I will let everybody go, if you're in Vancouver, to go and enjoy this rainy morning, and yeah, otherwise we'll see you. Thank you so much to everyone. Bye now.